caught up.
All right, awesome. Welcome everybody to the workshop. This is Beyond the Broadcast, Capture the Full Value of Your Sports Sponsorships. Again, thanks everybody for coming, especially to the panelists. Introducing, sitting to my right, we have Chris Kint, Senior Vice President of Activation and Communications from Red Bull. Then Dan Scalia, Senior Vice President from Stadium. And Keith Friedenberg, Executive Vice President of Global Insights, the Global Insights Group from WME IMG. So just before we kick things off, would love to have each of the panelists introduce themselves, and then we'll get going. So, Chris?
All right. Nice to meet everybody. Again, my name is Chris Kint, Red Bull Media House. Been there for about 5 years, helping to build the brand and the lifestyle of Red Bull. And before that, I attended many of these as being part of the advertising community here in New York. So thank you.
Yeah, Dan Scalia. We are 24/7 multi-sports network through a culmination of various different sports properties we've been launching in the past several years, designed to really be in position as the next generation sports network. So we deliver 24 hours of content, 7 days a week across every platform, every distribution channel, including over the air.
Hello, Keith Friedenberg. I run the Global Insights Group for WME IMG. We're really that internal think tank within the company, servicing both the entertainment WME side of the house as well as the sports IMG side of the house, and culinary and fashion, some other verticals as well. But any of our agents internally, our clients externally leverage us for insights about the consumer, the media landscape, the industry in general, and we lend a hand where we can.
Awesome. And lastly, I'm Jeff Katz, General Manager of Gum Gum Sports with Gum Gum, a computer vision company. And just to kind of set the stage a little bit for this panel, we have a nice mix of covering off on the brand perspective, but also the rights holder perspective as it relates to sports sponsorships, which is a pretty large industry at over $60 billion globally, the global sponsorship industry. And just to set the stage, brands are getting a lot more sophisticated about how they view and measure their sports sponsorship investments. And these same brands, they're demanding more transparency and detail to justify, but also demonstrate the value of those investments. And lastly, and they want all of this, it's got to be cross-channel. So it has to be across television, streaming, social, digital, you name it. We need to be able to understand that value and quantify it. So with that, a little bit about Gum Gum Sports. So there's a video that'll come on in a bit that basically shows how using computer vision we can capture all of the brands that appear in any given sports broadcast. And there's a lot of technology that goes into it, and we're looking at as many as 6 different factors to gauge the quality of those exposures. But without further ado, here's a little bit of what that looks like. And as we said, on any screen.
Crossfield ball. Alba with the cross. Danger here for Real Madrid as Neymar cutting inside. Beautiful pass for Suarez. Oh, what a finish.
All right.
Luis Suarez strikes first here in the Bernabeu. And Neymar does go for goal.
Inside. Iguodala just into the game. Gets his first 2. Quick substitution. Iguodala coming into the game. Green trying to draw the foul. Does not.
About capturing these moments, being a part of these moments, being embedded in these moments.
It's lights out and away we go. Both Rosberg and Hamilton get away well, as does Kimi Räikkönen as well, and Räikkönen takes 3rd place. Hamilton goes into the first 10 in the lead from Rosberg and Räikkönen, and then comes Daniel Ricciardo. Verstappen has spun. Verstappen spun, and Alonso's picked up.
So a little taste of what's happening kind of behind the scenes and what goes into kind of this new level of transparency and detail, all powered by computer vision. So coming back to kind of the panel, and definitely want to get your guys' take on a number of topics, including looking at the explosion of metrics, right? So if we look at it in digital advertising, It started with impressions, but now there's so much more, whether it's clicks, conversions, viewability, brand safety, ad fraud monitoring. There are a lot of different things you could be looking at now, and I'm just wondering, can you speak, Chris, maybe starting with you, can you speak a little bit to the explosion of these metrics and how that's translating into kind of the sponsorship realm and sports and everything that you guys do over at Red Bull?
Sure. So we actually take a slightly different take on it. And one way is we own all of our properties, right? So 90% of what we do, we own the sports property, the live broadcast of it across our own OTT platform, our own magazine with 450,000 subscribers. So we kind of own the whole ecosystem. Through that, though, we then figure out, as we do things, what is the metric we want to drive for each one of those events? Some of those it is to sell a ticket and get people engaged with the brand that way. Some of it is to get them to tune into an OTT platform. Essentially, what we're really trying to do is get you into our lifestyle, and then eventually what we'll do is we'll keep pulling you through the funnel to eventually get you to the can. But for us, for the most part, it's really, we don't look at a sponsorship. It's really is our marketing dollars creating and owning the event to drive the love of the brand.
Right. No, totally makes sense, and it's we talk about sports sponsorship in terms of embedding sponsors into the content. You are the content.
Correct.
Which is a really interesting take on it. How about you, Dan, in terms of the explosion of metrics and how it's making its way into your business?
Yeah, I mean, we try to kind of position ourselves from a distribution standpoint of smashing the standard kind of distribution paradigm.
Sure.
And as part of that, distributing content to all these different verticals, all these different platforms, each experience is pretty different. Each one of them stands for something. They're all very unique in their own way. As part of that, we can't just create content that looks compelling on an 80-inch device that's going to have just as much of appeal on a 7-inch device. But as part of that, and we also are being a 24/7 network, so we have to kind of position our programming in a way where we start at the final screen first and then kind of enlarge that from there.
Sure.
But every single platform we do distribute to tells kind of a different story and requires us to kind of learn on what's working on Twitter versus what is working with our live games on Facebook versus what's this over-the-air consumer who is sitting back on a couch watching on their digital antenna device. They may be looking for something different. So for us, it's really being able to try to tell a story for each one of those different channels.
Sure.
And then that we can read out to our programming team saying who's watching what and at what point and what's that kind of view look like.
Definitely interesting, looking at how up until very recently, TV was king, and now you guys are really thinking about all those other platforms and how to specifically tune the content to the platform without, necessarily having that TV first mentality, which is very interesting. How about yourself, Keith?
Well, from our perspective, it's interesting because we not only own properties, we represent them as well.
Sure.
We're kind of in some instances on both sides of the table.
Right.
As we look towards sponsorship and how to leverage it and be most effective with it. As the data guy within the company, there's no question that the worm is turned and the brands are far more sophisticated and far more direct as to valuation and identifying a real impact on the brand. Even within our own company, we kind of laughingly say the days of like a round of golf and a beer and a handshake is not going to drive a $100 million sponsorship deal anymore.
Right.
The industry itself has gotten far more sophisticated. There's new entrants in the space, a la GumGum as well.
Sure.
That gives us new tools to weaponize the data and make sure there's real efficacy between what the brand's trying to accomplish and what the property is offering.
Yeah, no, it makes sense, and I think. Let's keep it with you for a second, Keith. I love that term that you used in a previous conversation about the next generation CMO.
Yep.
And just how, can you describe, the nature of today's marketing leaders and how it's evolving in terms of what's important to them and their mindset?
I think this quote-unquote next generation of CMOs that are in the marketplace by no means are looking to numbers to disrupt deals or impede deals. They're actually looking at the numbers in a way to actually double down on them.
Sure.
If something really is working, it actually opens up more revenue to come through, not less. So I think initially guys like me walking into meetings, even 3 or 4 years ago, were kind of like the Grim Reapers, walking in. We're here to kill deals, and just the opposite has happened.
Yeah.
It actually, the numbers empower deals because the CMOs believe they're being more efficient with their spend. They're being more targeted with the segments they're trying to attack. And if it works, they'll even double down further on it.
Right.
So I think they're looking for validation that they're making smart bets. And nothing's perfect, and you try to give as much insight as you can. But when it clicks the right way, then you can really generate, not only lifetime value in the fan, but lifetime camaraderie between the property and the brand.
Yeah, it makes sense. I'd say also an example of that perhaps is, a placement, a piece of signage that doesn't necessarily get a lot of play on television, but may get a lot of play on social. Right? Historically, you price it out based on the value of the television broadcast, but there's this tremendous value in social. All of a sudden, that placement can kind of take on a new life and become even more appealing. In this case, I'm thinking of the walkway to an arena being branded, and how sometimes if there's a storyline, an interesting storyline, that can really pick up on social.
Well, from a sponsorship perspective, how do you drive moments into a movement? And that fan, let's say it's IMG College, or it's Lollapalooza, or it's Miss Universe, whatever the property might be. Someone holding up a Budweiser bottle and taking a selfie with their friends is as life affirming as you can get as a marketer. I mean, that's in the moment, and that passion for the sport tied to the brand that they're holding in their hands is powerful.
Yeah.
So all those moments that are previously not being tracked effectively are now coming back into the mix. And if you're a brand, that's just like manna from heaven if you're a brand.
Yeah, it makes sense. And how about from your perspective in terms of next generation CMO and this kind of new mindset?
I would take it a little bit higher from where you're at, which is we really look at it as building and fostering our communities. It's really no longer just broadcasting. I'm just loudly shouting out my message as loud as I can. Really nowadays, it's that triumvirate of the brand and peers and peers. How do you put your brand in the middle while the community around you is talking about you to make you cool and hip and everything else that you want to be to the people within you? So when those pictures do happen, it is organic and it's not forced. It's not some brand.
It's authentic.
It's authentic, right? But that's what we really look to do. How do we stoke that fire that allows the communities to continue to talk about you? They're giving them something that they want to interact with and then use as the currency to help you. And then every once in a while, you insert the brand in a way, again, it's authentic, to kind of stoke and kind of blow some oxygen into that fire to heat it back up again.
Great.
Totally makes sense. And how about from your perspective, next generation CMO and what that means for Stadium's business?
Yeah, I mean, sports as a whole, right? Obviously, the consumption behavior and kind of that shift in how ratings are changing. And since 2015, numbers have just slowly kind of declined from what is on television to where it doesn't mean that people aren't watching it anymore. It just means that they're watching across different channels.
Sure.
I think that's required all of us, not just marketers and not just sellers or buyers, to start kind of reacting a little bit differently. I mean, from us being a challenger-based brand, we have to outwork, we have to out-hustle, and we have to outsmart anybody else. And by doing that, we have to get smarter about kind of what is the story that's going on across this channel that we might be distributing on, whether it's Amazon or if it's Sling TV. What is that kind of experience? Because we recognize as a content owner, the experiences are going to be different across the board, but we have to still have one theme. We still have to kind of have one story. We have to stand for something. So I think it's required all of us to start kind of paying a bit more attention to just saying, I mean, I would love it if we were able to sell $100 million sponsorships. Just kind of say, this is our network. This is kind of what that looks like. But we can't anymore. So now it's just figuring other ways. How do we kind of massage this opportunity so that it is the most effective?
Sure.
And it's a bit of a cliche, but it's contextualization. How you hit the right consumer on the right device with the right content, where that little spark gets fired off.
Right.
And and again, it's amazing when you get the alchemy right. It's amazing, and we all struggle to get there.
Sure. And I guess that also gets at another unique element of sponsorships, in particular sports sponsorships, when you look at the way that it's embedded in the content itself, whether it's signage or the putting on an event. And that kind of brings us to this, these two trends of, ad skipping and ad blocking, right? And how much of a selling point from your perspective is it that when the brand is actually embedded in the content and therefore it travels with the content and doesn't necessarily get left behind as perhaps a 30-second spot might get left behind. So anyone who wants to kind of jump in there, feel free.
You want to start?
Yeah, I mean, for us, it's not so much of kind of leading with that sell. It's not so much of saying, hey, we can create an integrated program with any one of our partners and this is going to prevent consumers or from Xing out of it and leaving the page. But it does create an opportunity. it does create an ability for us to develop a really authentic level of integration, whether it's in studio or going on site or heading to the Super Bowl or doing some sort of integrated program that does a strong story there that's creating that hook for the next show that we do create.
Sure.
Now, not all of them I heard on a panel yesterday. Not every integrated program needs to be shot on Mount Everest, but there has to be a lot of them that do create a pretty impactful type of experience. Now, again, we don't lead with it being kind of this is an ad blocking prevention tool, but we do use it as a way for us to, one of our things that we're very proud of is creating this premium sports experience that is on these small devices. But we have to allow consumers to have that kind of conversation with us and able to talk to them about it.
Sure, makes sense.
And then for us, by owning what we're doing, the event itself is our name, like Red Bull Rampage, or you have the New York Red Bulls, and you have the stadium, you have the jerseys, like everything travels with it. It's the entertainment that you are providing, and that by us putting on the entire thing, whether it's a Vulcan Pipe Pro that we're live streaming through our OTT channel, to then taking that same content and cutting it down from a 4-day event to a 2-hour event and putting that on NBC and calling that the Red Bull Signature Series that hosts, once a Saturday every month. You're really getting it out everywhere from just the content itself, just being so organic and orgained in what it is. And that's how we go about it. We actually spend very little in television from an advertising perspective. Really, our marketing thrust is an earned, shared, and owned. And most of that is through owning our own properties and having people come out, experience the brand, be part of the brand. We're also one of the largest samplers in the entire United States. We were #1 the past couple of years. I'm assuming we'll be #1 this year. But again, I get you to come out, you have a great day, you have a great time, you sample a flavor or addition of what we have, and just start to pull you into that way.
Sure.
We're kind of lucky at WME-IMG in the sense that we kind of have something to sell to everybody. So across our company, whether, again, it could be a Lollapalooza music festival, it could be a taste event where obviously culinary is really featured.
Sure.
It could be the UFC or the PBR in sports. It could be New York Fashion Week, for example. So we have the benefit of a broad ecosystem of content and platforms to play with, which means as a researcher it's great because we actually can provide that context about women in Fashion Week, or that hardcore young male in the UFC, or that more sophisticated, more palate-oriented person that wants to go to a taste festival. So we have the benefit of a nice, array of content to play with, and we can sort of hyper-target our sponsors into the right ecosystem. So for us, that's just a sort of a benefit with us. And as a research person, it's a pleasure because, that's not quite the right mix. Well, we got this as well.
Yeah.
So or if we cross-pollinate between two properties, is there an actual overall lift across two disparate sort of ecosystems of content?
Sure. Yeah, and I'd say, coming back to that macro kind of theme of, television, right, and the evolution of television in the context of sponsorships. So, the TV valuation used to be king, right? It's all about how many seconds of exposure did I get on the TV broadcast. And I think, one of the interesting trends that we're seeing, like take the NBA, for example, when they have a local broadcast, they have, plenty of sponsors in view, front and center. And those sponsors, we call them local because they're on these regional sports networks that have local audiences, seemingly, right? But now it's taking on a life of its own, a new life in social where it's a global audience. Mm-hmm. So that traditional signage it's no longer traditional. It really is an integrated, cross-channel kind of buy. So it's a really exciting time to be associated with it, I feel like.
Well, I think from our perspective, we are trying to unlock the metrics behind the valuations. So case in point with GumGum, for example,
sure.
We did recently do a test for UFC 213, and we were curious, are the brands associated with this live event, UFC 213, how are they being picked up in social, not just through owned channels, but through non-owned channels?
Sure.
And is there a heat and is that moment being shared from that live experience within the venue? And is GumGum, for example, capturing that? And are we able to then put a true intrinsic value to it to weave that into our metrics between broadcast exposure and audio exposure and now social media exposure, whether earned or owned? Is impactful for us. It's another wedge in the pie that we're able to put some numbers against.
Yeah.
Which even a couple years ago, we really didn't have that visibility into call it the visual currency within social. So it's helped us.
We actually have the same thing in terms of, we call it our coverage database, and it really tells you the exact coverage of the brand. So whether it's the image that you're crawling through the web or social or television, or it's print, or it's mobile, whatever, we're crawling all these spaces, all the social channels, the print channels, and at the end of the day, it comes back and it says, okay, hey, this is how much exposure, this is a value, and it's all, we own this actually proprietary internal, so I'm not going to say that it's 100% accurate, it is what it is. But we have, though, for over 5 years, been trying to track and get a value for all these things to really understand where and how the brand lives and what its perception is in all these different venues or avenues.
And this new life that this content is taking on in social, one way that rights holders could look at it is a way to insulate from any potential downward pricing pressure if it's just based on TV. Whether the TV audience is actually declining or just not necessarily increasing as quickly. So there's that element, and then from the brand perspective, just knowing that you can have that upside, that amplification via social, it seems like a powerful value proposition.
And by the way, we are at this inflection point in terms of linear versus digital, and we all acknowledge that. The misconception is, the sky's falling, which it's not. It's shifting.
Sure.
And that's something we have to acknowledge and play with and see what modalities of execution are best. But to not acknowledge or measure digital effectively gives the wrong impression that linear is being shaved off a little bit. And that's something we're trying to make sure as one sort of gets re-engineered, we're acknowledging the impact of the other.
Sure. And looking at computer vision, one of the things that it enables is we don't need to rely on text as much as we used to, especially on social media. So that kind of brings me to when we talk about signage. If let's say a particular brand buys a sign, it's rare that brand would be called out in a hashtag because they're not the focus, right? The focus is the sport, the moment, and that brand wants to be wrapped right into that moment and be associated with that moment. So I guess, Chris, I'd love to hear your perspective on hashtags. Like, when do hashtags matter?
Yep.
And when does it feel forced? And especially as a millennial, towing that line of authentic.
I'd have to say, for myself, I really don't think hashtags work overly well. Maybe I'm just really bad at writing them, but overall, I just don't see them getting a ton of life. Either the community does a much better job on their own of doing it, or I think when you look at the natural disasters we just had, and you have a hashtag that people rally around, it gives them a moment, a cause, then I think you really break through. But trying to do a stupid hashtag to get you to tune into something or to go to an event, it just feels forced and it feels like it's from the brand. That's why I usually let the communities kind of go, and the ones that we like will kind of help foster. Or like I said, around a cause that really speaks louder and bigger than what you are.
That makes sense. I guess, also coming back to that social amplification, you mentioned owned versus non-owned or official versus unofficial. One of the challenges of capturing sponsor activity outside of official accounts. An official account meaning if I'm a particular team and I broadcast from my accounts content, I know that if I look at those accounts and I find sponsors or logos for that sponsor, that team, I know I can attribute it to that team. But when you look outside of it, let's say Pepsi, let's say Pepsi is the logo. If I do logo recognition on all of social media, how do I know what posts are relevant to that sponsorship, right? And so logo recognition kind of falls flat in that instance where it could just be someone holding a can versus, is this post related to a sport? If so, what sport? If so, what league, what team, away arena, home arena, and kind of, but once we solve that problem, then it's this idea of being able to then benefit from being able to include that in an analysis.
Well, for example, if you take Wimbledon, for example, and Rolex has been a longtime sponsor of Wimbledon, someone takes a selfie in the crowd, they might say, hey, Djokovic just won, or Serena just won. But are you getting the context from the text that was written? Is it the shot of the stadium that they're in?
Right.
Are you aware of where they are? again, back to the context issue, you could grab or theoretically grab a Rolex logo anywhere, and take a shot of it and use it. But how are you mishmashing all of the data points and the metadata together to identify the fact that that's a legitimate sponsor-oriented hit relative to Wimbledon that we're trying to nurture? It's text-driven, visually driven, geotagging driven. There's a lot of metrics around that. But once you drill in and you can identify the context behind it, it's great.
Yeah, and I think, Chris, what you were talking about, authenticity and the idea of facilitating versus broadcasting, it seems like the unofficial accounts, the long tail of social, is this great opportunity to just kind of see the content take on a life of its own, right? Whether it's a sports highlight that has funny memes in it or animations in it, like Thor, at the U.S. Open, when there was a pretty major upset at the U.S. Open, it showed him holding the Thor hammer. It was pretty impactful, and go ahead.
I will say this: there are methods to the madness in the sense that you can do effective activations where the activation itself is worthy of communication.
Sure.
It's not all just wallpaper. Sometimes you actually do something really cool.
Yeah.
Where WME-IMG in collaboration with a brand wants to kick it up a notch and do something unique, and to the consumers or fans that come to that event, that is acknowledged. Where it's like, oh, that actually is cool what they did, and even though it's in a very authentic way, the brand's involved, and they're probably plastered all over it. But the way the activation was architected, it was engaging and worthy of acknowledgement by a fan as they're walking by it.
Sure.
So I think there's ways to avoid the wallpaper, elevate the activation, which you guys are obviously kings of as well, and take it to another notch up the ladder.
Yeah, totally makes sense. And in terms of just how valuable is this long tail of social is a question we get a lot, and we're seeing anywhere from say 40 to 90% of the value of any given valuation is coming from the long tail versus the official. And I'd say the NBA is really on the high end of that because they're very conducive to sharing and the bite-sized nature of the clips. Just like minute-long clips. Each minute could be a different highlight.
It's snackable.
Snackable. There we go. So so I think the NBA is really feeling a very healthy benefit in their valuations from that long tail. And I think other leagues are catching on and really looking to drive that upside as well. So kind of shifting gears a little bit, I think Dan would love to get your take on this. Are all brand integrations equal? And what I mean by that is, how do you balance the fan experience with the brand integration, and then how do you also set the price and kind of manage all of that?
Sure. And we kind of lean on GumGum to assist with that, right? I think the story that we're kind of telling the market of being this league-owned multi-sport network that is delivered digital first that extends into television, we knew we were able to kind of carve out a little bit of white space for ourselves. But by doing that, we also knew that we were susceptible to kind of better understanding who that consumer was across each one of these channels and what are they looking for. In the same way we go about our programming of determining kind of what is going to go on Twitter or what is going to be going across all these other verticals, we also need to do that with how we're monetizing that and recognizing that it's not a one-size-fits-all, and over the air, standard kind of television-like integrations are acceptable. Consumers are kind of used to that, but they're not used to that on mobile devices. So how do we kind of massage what that looks like between each one of those channels? And as part of that, we also recognize that someone who is interacting on their phone may not have the attention span that someone's going to be on their couch.
Sure.
So we're going to value those a little bit differently as well. So we're really kind of, the way we're positioning this is approaching it in a couple different ways. One, let's use this as a way to go back to our partners and say, this is the type of value that we've created for you based on all these different kind of verticals, right? The share of voice, the clarity, the size of the screen, the level of engagement, the interactivity. But then also going back to our programming team of saying we did an exceptional job activating this brand for X, Y, and Z reason.
Sure.
Or we didn't do that great of a job because we utilized standard integrations that everybody finds to be kind of Nobody's really feeling as though it's impactful anymore, so they're not caring about it all that much. So then we're going to shift that the next go around.
Sure.
So for us, it's really important to kind of fully articulate what that message is, because we know we have a pretty short window to kind of get that right.
Yeah, and certainly the different levels of integration, right? So you've got, at the very basic level, you could throw a hashtag on there, right? Or other levels of integration within the video, whether it's an overlay or a pillow on a couch that's branded, or a pillar in the background, and just how do all those play together and contribute to the ultimate, media value.
Right.
Right.
And as compelling as it is,
Oh, go ahead.
as compelling as it is to have someone like a Captain Obvious inside our studio, a lot of other broadcasters did the exact same thing. So it's not all that compelling just as a standalone, but being able to say the level of interactivity that we created and the value we created for Captain Obvious on Apple TV, on Roku, on Pluto TV, over the air, on mobile, Twitter, Facebook, and showing kind of what the value we were able to do on each one of those channels, that becomes a pretty tight story, especially if you can kind of start putting a bow around it, and then you can take that to the client.
Right.
So that's kind of how we're looking at all of it.
I was just going to comment on the fact sometimes in the sports world we kind of knee-jerk to the NFLs, NBAs, NHLs, NASCARs of the world that clearly are major properties and very successful. But most fans, particularly of call it mid-lane to more niche-oriented sports, they acknowledge the symbiotic relationship between sponsorship and empowering the sport that they're actually engaged with. So in our world, on a little bit smaller scale, it might be a color run, it might be a local execution in a particular city, or Escape from Alcatraz as sort of a live event, or mass participation event.
Yep.
And in that context, the fans know, hey, these sponsors are actually helping make this happen.
Right.
And that tip of the hat or that acknowledgement is even beyond authenticity of the correlation between the brand and the property. It's actually a bit of thanks and appreciation, because some of these events actually wouldn't happen without sponsorship empowering them. So I think we get a little bit caught up in the big gun guys,
Sure.
and they deserve a lot of credit for what they do.
Sure.
But there are tons of other sports that are out there where the fans absolutely acknowledge, and in testing that we've done in many different sports, where it's like, oh, they're helping make this happen. So I want to be supportive of that brand, and actually literally transport that activation that's live in an actual sporting context and take it to the store, because there's actually again that recognition that they're keeping their passions alive and helping keep their passions alive.
And I think two brands have done an incredible job with, and I'm not saying it because he's here, but you call the Red Bull team the Red Bull team. And just what Gatorade's doing with the G League, like it's developing such a value there, and then allows them to kind of get deeper into performance metrics and tying in kind of fitness tracking, all that type of stuff. So it can be done, right? Not all people can do that, but there is kind of really cool story when it comes to all that.
Yeah, and definitely, with Red Bull putting on the actual events, right? Without Red Bull, there is no event. I would imagine it resonates with your fan base.
Especially when you talk about the niche sports, because the majority of what we do are smaller sports.
Board sports, for example.
Yeah.
I mean,
Huge acknowledgement within those communities that we are making it happen. What makes it also so great about it is when we put on a Rampage, which is our big downhill mountain bike event, we actually invite the best of the best. So I don't care if you have Monster, I don't care if you have Rockstar on your helmet. I'm going to put on the best event. And you know what? If Rockstar ends up winning and he's on the podium in #1, it is what it is.
Right.
It's still, though, the best in that field.
Yeah, makes sense. And we've touched on a lot, but I just want to outright ask you guys. So, if you had to kind of sum it up, how would you approach, or how do you guys approach sports media valuation overall? That's kind of the first element. And then, what type of media and data partners would you like to work with, and why? And lastly, where do you see the space going? So, whenever either any of you want to kind of jump in, just to kind of sum it up, how you approach it overall.
I would say from at least our perspective within WME-IMG is that the big thing to realize is that there is no silver bullet. It's a multi-headed hydra. You have to engage with multiple vendors across multiple platforms to make sure you're getting the best, hopefully most accurate numbers you can. We work with over 50 vendors on an ongoing basis. On a domestic as well as international level, and you cobble together the best metrics you can across a pantheon of vendors, and you put something together that you think's got real efficacy behind it. And the main point, at least from our perspective, is transparency.
Yeah.
How'd you get that number? We can flow back and reverse engineer every single number that makes its way into evaluation. And that's where our credibility comes in.
Sure.
And we openly acknowledge some is actually internal business intelligence and some is external consumer insights. But you soup it all together and you hopefully have a real battle plan to prove that the sponsorship had real value and how should we maneuver and architect what we're doing next time around. So, I think you have to play with multiple players and be completely transparent about how you're playing with them.
Makes sense. I hear transparent a lot. I hear being able to justify everything, every data point.
Sure.
It's the standards are getting higher for sure.
Absolutely.
How about you guys?
I would just add that I know we've been focused on sports for this, but we also put on a ton of concerts. We put on a 2-week festival here in New York. We put on a 30-day concert in LA. We put on a 30 days worth of concerts in Chicago. We do Culture Clash in Atlanta. And to your point, these are all different pieces that work together. And for us, as we talked about, it's not sponsorship, it's ownership. And by owning and creating content and entertainment that people want, that's where we really drive our value. Now, that value could be from, like I said before, buying a ticket, to coming out to our charity run, to watching on an OTT platform, which we're then monetizing. So for us, it really comes back in a multitude of different ways, but as opposed to just sponsoring, I'd rather create an event. You talked about getting people out. I would say at this point, probably 60% of what we actually put on is consumer facing with consumers as the participants. As I talked about, the more you get them with the brand, talking about the brand, feeling it, being part of it, the more it just fosters that. And that's what we look to really drive the value.
Yeah, we do it a couple different ways. We work closely with each one of as a content owner, you create quite a bit of leverage in the market. So any one of our distribution deals affords us the opportunity to really work with them hand in hand and better understanding because certainly they want to create the best content experience on their platforms. And we utilize a lot of the data that they provide. Then we have our own proprietary data that we're leveraging across all the different channels we're distributing on. It does subject us, though, to certain platforms that aren't very much up to speed. Digital Antennas, the modern version of Bunny Ears, is not exactly the most sophisticated platform right now. It's a compelling platform because no sports broadcaster can really implement into it just yet. But we also recognize that ComScore and Nielsen aren't really in a position to provide that level of data to us. But also, as part of that, we then leverage local communities and individual markets to better understand exactly what they want out of stadium.
Yeah.
And if we can just listen to 5, 6, 8 different markets at any given time, and then amplify that out to start looking more nationally across the 22 million homes and all those different pieces, now we can start telling a better story. And we can then have data lead to our decision making versus just saying, I think the show is going to do well.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to thank you guys for joining us here. Amazing perspective, I think, on a very quickly evolving landscape. So kudos to you guys for staying up on these things and really trailblazing. And I think, just to recap a little bit, themes that I'm hearing, definitely brands are getting more sophisticated. Rights holders who are conveying value to the brands are also getting very sophisticated in how they view and convey the value of these events. And there's a lot that goes into it, whether it's finding the content, being able to go beyond official accounts and social media. Once you find an exposure, to your point, Keith, around justifying it and quantifying that value and being able to pull back and prove that you actually delivered the value that you say you delivered. I'd say that's another.
If I could mention this one last thing, people look at valuation and analytics around valuation with the wrong perspective. It's not about the gotcha moment. Oh, I proved that you didn't deliver what you promised to deliver me. I got you. It's actually about optimizing for the next time you engage with the brand and the property.
Sure.
So if you actually look at it, the analytics from a future cast perspective versus a gotcha moment looking backwards, it actually changes the entire dynamic around the conversation. Yeah. And I think some people are caught in that, we're scared of analytics because we're going to have these gotcha moments. It's like, no. Yeah. We're actually going to optimize for the next time we engage with you and make it even better. And the analytics is going to help us get there.
Yeah, and with the computer vision, the idea is you get that data right away so that you can optimize, course correct as quickly as possible.
Itemize in the moment.
Yeah.
Before an event's even over.
Right. Absolutely. And I'd say I think the other trend or the other thing that really stuck with me is just this idea of facilitation versus broadcasting, and kind of the way that TV is still very much in view, but there's a whole ecosystem there, and the rights holder controls a portion of that ecosystem, but there's certainly this very authentic, fan-based, fan-driven, kind of startup-driven ecosystem around that content as well, that we want to, at least I think everyone over here wants to embrace, and to the extent that you can embrace it, hopefully both sides, the brand side and the rights holder side, can benefit. So again, thank you very much, everybody, and yeah, if you have any questions, we'll be around. We're happy to mingle with anybody who wants to take any of these conversations further. So thank you very much.
It was a good time.